Ellen.
John.
Remember this guy from our Person on the Street interviews? Episode 4, I think it was. His name is George, and he lives where I live, Durham, North Carolina.
I don't know the history. I just know that this is definitely not the best version of capitalism. I think we could be doing much better. Yeah.
Oh, yes, I remember George. And my, oh my, does George have a lot of company in feeling that way.
You know this better than I, Ellen. It's basically been your beat for many years, right? Including those years writing for Fortune magazine, talking with people, in particular business leaders, about how to make capitalism better.
It really was a slow boil, and then suddenly it was a full-fledged conversation at panel discussions and conferences and podcasts. COVID had a lot to do with it. The murder of George Floyd had a lot to do with it. And then suddenly we were in a full series of conversations about what capitalism could be, how it could serve more than just the shareholder and the bottom line. And we were just in a world of 1,000 different ideas on all of this.
This is where we make the turn to the home stretch in this season. We're going to spend some time now, over 2 episodes, exploring ways that people are trying to change things, either to make this economic system better, more humane, more fair, more healthy and sustainable, or to transform things radically, to build an economy that's fundamentally different from capitalism as we know it.
I think we're going to find, John, that there's not always a clear line that everyone would agree on between economic features that are capitalist or are not capitalist.
Yes, that's true. And in this series, we really haven't been hung up on those ideological labels.
Right. We've tried to just talk in plain English about what's actually gone down historically and how stuff works in the real world.
But that said, we are going to try to do somewhat different things in these last episodes. In the final episode, coming in a couple weeks, we're going to look at more transformative models. Approaches that really do seem to reject capitalism's fundamental assumptions and structures, or turn those assumptions on their heads.
So stay tuned for that one. In this episode, we're going to explore what you could call reforms, which hold on to core capitalist features like private ownership and the profit motive, but try to manage things so that markets work better and do a better job of serving people and other living things.
From the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, this is Scene on Radio, Season 7, Capitalism, Episode 11. I'm John Biewen.
And I'm Ellen McGirt. We've been exploring the world's dominant economic system and how people shaped it over time. Now, the question is, what to do, given that a growing number of people believe that capitalism, at least in its current form, is doing more harm than good.
In this episode, we hear from some people who want to fix or fine-tune capitalism. In Episode 6, we heard about the 30 glorious years, the decades of social democracy in the United States. Quite a few other countries have long had versions of social democracy, and plenty of folks in those societies would say it's working quite well, thank you. Life's pretty good with a mix of capitalist markets and empowered workers, tight regulations on business, and a strong welfare state, including stuff like universal health care, affordable, high-quality child care, abundant public housing, free college and vocational training, etc., etc. So some of the reforms that people advocate for in the U.S. involve strengthening that kind of balance.
That's a long-running debate, one that should and will continue. So instead of dwelling on government's role in supplementing the capitalist market system, we're going to focus on efforts to make capitalism itself work better for more people and for the planet. John, you're going to share some conversations you've had with people thinking about and acting on these ideas. For starters, you're going to take us back to Spain. Lucky you.
Yep. See you soon. Hola. The corporate headquarters of this company, 2/3, don't look like corporate headquarters. It's a handsome house, several stories high, on a winding, narrow street on the edge of Mount Tibidabo, overlooking Barcelona. From here you can barely see the Columbus Monument down below, poking up like a toothpick from the cityscape, several miles away. The staff at 2/3 ranges from young to youngish. And sure enough, there's a big, beautiful dog padding around.
Different departments. That's the web and marketing team. Here's finance and operations. That's the coffee machine. That's the most important. It's the only one working all day here.
This is the boss and founder, Lutz Schwenke. And yeah, that's not a Spanish-sounding name. He's a German transplant who also lived in Hawaii for a year in his younger days, which helps explain his ease with English.
This is all the fabrics. This is like, here's pattern making, where you make all the cuts.
Schwenke's company makes clothing. The name 2/3 refers to the oceans, which cover 2/3 of the earth. The company is kind of a surfing fashion brand.
Probably 90% of the customers don't surf or have anything to do with it at all. And a lot of people buy us because of the sustainability of the product or the design of the product in general. So it's surf-inspired.
Lutz, who is 44, is a surfer. But that's only a small part of why he eventually founded 2/3. He started out wanting to address problems in the world. He went to work for the United Nations and started on a PhD looking at economic development in South America. But he abandoned the doctorate.
It was all a bit too slow, maybe, having that feeling, what am I doing this for? And I come from an entrepreneurial family. And somehow that was always something on my mind.
He started thinking about building a business.
It was rather like, I would like to found a company that has sort of something more than making money and has some type of idealism. And I just started to scan the market. So I even thought about a fair trade lemonade. Then I started to read a lot about fashion, and I became more focused rather on the sustainability part than on the fair trade part, because I realized that was the third or second most toxic industry in the world. I read about cotton, about how all the farmers have a lot of problem with the pesticides, etc., and read a couple of books. So then at some point it was like, okay, I want to create a clothing brand, and it should be sustainable.
Schwenke founded 2/3 in 2010. He wanted to set a good example in the fashion industry, which has a brutal reputation for many good reasons. Start with the notorious garment sweatshops in East and South Asia, where workers often earn poverty wages in miserable and dangerous conditions.
Let's say we don't have any offshore factories or anything like this, everything.
2/3 garments are sewn by contractors in Spain and Portugal, with European Union wages and working standards. Schwenke says the Portuguese workers who make his company's clothes start at about 1,000 euros a month, 10 times the typical pay in India or Bangladesh. It's only $1,100, but the cost of living in Portugal is barely half what it is in the United States or a big Spanish city.
The areas where it's produced in north of Portugal, it's quite impressive. I mean, if you go here into Barcelona and you order coffee with milk, you pay 2.50, 3 euros. Whereas you go there into the villages, and I ended up paying 90 cents for a coffee. So also you see that.
Those European garment factories also have to meet EU environmental standards, unlike the plants in parts of Asia where environmentalists have captured awful images for decades.
I don't want to name a country, but you have this factory in country X, and they dye the product, and there's a river just behind, and the river has the same color of the day than the clothing that they produce inside, and there's still a lot more of that you think.
2/3 doesn't use any conventional cotton grown with pesticides. It uses organic and recycled cotton and other fabrics like hemp and linen. But the most unusual business practice that Lutz and his company adopted is meant to address yet another fashion industry sin: waste. It's estimated that globally, humans are hauling clothing to landfills and incinerators at the rate of one garbage truck every second, 24/7.
It's crazy. It's a system of total overproduction.
The fast fashion industry has doubled production since 2000, making mountains of cheap, low-quality garments designed to be worn just a few times. And sure enough, people are buying more clothes than ever and wearing those garments fewer times before tossing them. In part because of this excessive production, the clothing industry produces more greenhouse gases than air travel and global shipping combined. There's so much overproduction that a staggering 10 to 30% of new garments are never sold even once.
So what I think is actually quite outrageous that a lot of the, especially high fashion brands, burn their overstocks because they don't want their margins to be destroyed or some kind of second black market. There's now actually a European law coming out, which they can't do it anymore. They will prohibit it. So
to avoid adding to this waste, Schwenke decided that his company, which operates online, would not just produce a bunch of garments and throw them onto the market. 2/3 adopted a pre-order system,
where we put a couple of products online, we see how they sell, then we project the sales, and while people keep ordering over a period of time, we produce projected amounts, and we don't just produce not knowing. And yeah, that basically results in us selling 100% of our stocks.
2/3 is one of thousands of companies all over the world trying to do good, or at least to do less harm, while also doing well. There's been an overt move in parts of the business world over a couple of decades to reject the greed is good mentality of the 1980s and to say, we care about things other than the bottom line, the planet, our workers, diversity and equity. The phrases have proliferated. Conscious capitalism, ESG, referring to a concern for environmental, social, and governance issues, stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. One obvious challenge is to take all this talk beyond good intentions and PR. 2/3 got itself certified in 2022 as a B Corp. The U.S.-based nonprofit B Lab created the B Corp certification in 2006, aiming to make business a force for good. For real, not just in glossy magazine ads. There are now 9,000 certified B Corps in 101 countries, according to B Lab. There's another, even larger group of companies that have a legal designation as benefit corporations. Both B Corps and benefit corporations write into their governance documents that they will balance profit and purpose and consider their impact on stakeholders, workers, customers, suppliers, communities, the environment. But only B Corps are assessed by an outside party, B Lab, to make sure they're behaving according to measurable standards.
So it was not hard for us to get those points. It also came down to packaging, no use of plastics, and then I think in general we have a lot of support programs for our employees and stuff like this, which they value that quite a lot. Yeah.
Lutz says when he started 2/3 as a consciously green fashion company in 2010, there were few models to be inspired by, other than the much-admired Patagonia. But now he sees things changing quickly in the for-profit business world, especially in response to the climate emergency, even though that response is agonizingly late.
And I think we all have this weird feeling of saying, wow, if we would have shifted in the 70s or 80s when all the Greens that we thought were all crazy were lobbying for that change, if that change would have been shifted then, we would be in a totally different situation. But what really keeps my hopes high is to see over those 12 years that at the beginning it wasn't moving, and now it's just all of a sudden everything is recycled, everybody's pushing to waste. It's like this tipping point where you see wow. And I for example have my best friend, he runs quite a big venture fund for solar energy, and it's also there he did it in the exact same time that we did it with 2/3. And at the beginning it was a bit here, a bit there, a bit there. And now they're basically, they're just flooding the world with solar panels. I've never seen scales like this, insane. Whole countries just, if that could continue this way and that speed could really keep up. And then obviously you still have this like lobby against it of all those industry that makes money with what's not good for the world at the moment. And they obviously don't want to let go. But I think it's a matter of time. I just hope it's still on time.
But it isn't easy, Schwenke says, to run a company like 2/3 given the pressures in the marketplace. When I visit, he's struggling over a question. The company's annual sales are about $20 million. Lutz is thinking he may need to expand the company to about 5 times that size.
It's not only the question, okay, do I need to go to 100 million to be safe as a company, to have my workers safe and everything is like, you have that size, you're not a little boat that just falls with the first little wave that's coming. Also, to be honest, if I look at the market of clothing, you either grow or you die. Like if I just look at companies, I don't know any company that stays at 10, 20 million for 30 years. It just doesn't exist. They either they disappear or they grow.
Being bigger, he says, would give his company more economies of scale and more clout to negotiate with fabric sellers, for example, who don't like to make what for them are small batches of material. On the other hand, he worries that a move to expand 2/3 could risk what makes the company special and unusually ethical.
Because now I operate on my own. No one tells me what to do. I can shape everything I want. If I would, for example, have an investor, can I still provide that?
In other words, would a partnering investor, which he would need to grow quickly, insist that the company abandon some of its principles to maximize profits?
And the question is, can we come to 100 million in our way, or do we again, and that's the biggest thing that's in my head at the moment,
Speaking of the importance of investors, back down in the heart of the city, I've come to the Barcelona branch of Triodos Bank. It's in a castle-like building that was designed in the early 1900s, my host tells me with pride, by a disciple of Antoni Gaudi.
Gaudi, the famous architect.
This is the branch's manager, Jordi Yadja Yespinal.
Yadja. It's a very Catalan surname.
Triodos was founded in 1980 in the Netherlands. It has branches in the UK, Germany, Belgium, and Spain. It calls itself an ethical bank. That means, for one thing, that when customers deposit money in their accounts, Triodos invests that money only in the real economy, not in financial instruments that just turn capital into more capital. And it invests only in a select range of projects.
First of all, we finance projects that has a positive social impact. Social impact means that we want to impact positively in the cultural sector, social sector, and in environmental sector.
Of course, Yadja explains, the bank seeks to invest in projects that will make money.
But the most important thing is that if all these operations are not impacting positively in the society, even if they are very profitable, we don't participate, we don't collaborate. For example, we fund operations related with green energies and never with fuel or fossil fuels, for example.
Like 2/3, Triodos is a certified B Corp since 2015. The bank has 750,000 customers in Europe with $20 billion in assets under management. It invests in environmental projects like solar and wind farms and organic farms, in social projects like affordable housing, and in cultural industries.
For example, in culture, most of the Spanish movies are financed by Triodos, and you can see it when you watch this movie in the theaters. So, of course, we can get money out of these three sectors.
Another striking way in which Triodos parts ways with a typical banking corporation, certainly an American one. In the United States, the CEOs of large corporations are now paid more than 300 times the salary of the average employee in their company, including income from company stock. That differential has soared in the neoliberal years, from an average ratio of 20-1 back in 1965. A top Triodos official in Spain told me the company's highest paid executive makes no more than 9 times the lowest paid worker in the company.
And so does that mean that people like yourselves, you could go to a traditional bank and make a higher salary than you do now, make more money?
Yeah, but I take it in the other way. I mean, I left the traditional banking just for working in this one. I said, okay, if I don't work in something that has a meaning in my life, like, for example, these projects here, I'm not working anymore for the conventional banking. So, yeah, of course, the salaries are a bit lower, but it's not all about the money.
The salaries are adequate?
Salaries are okay. Yeah.
It's not all about the money. The money is enough because other things matter too. This goes to a major theme from Marjorie Kelly, the author of Wealth Supremacy, who we last heard in episode 7. Kelly argues that a huge amount of damage comes from the idea that profits, the gains that go to owners and shareholders, must be maximized. That article of faith needs to go away, she says.
What I say is that we need companies that are profit-making, but not profit maximizing. And there's all the difference in the world is in there. You need a profit just to stay alive, right? You need more money coming in than going out. That's kind of a rule of life in the economy. But maximizing profits, buying newspapers and squeezing them to death until they lie on the floor and die, no, that isn't necessary. We don't need to maximize profits, and that's what we need to step away from.
There are, and always have been, business people in the profit-making world who were happy to make enough and not necessarily the most profit possible. But a lot of observers, including some who work in business, say large-scale change will never happen by merely encouraging that choice as a matter of values or virtue. Many argue the capitalist system needs a good, strong push. And that means changing some rules. Here's one way to look at the idea of a better capitalism. What if the free market consistently worked as advertised by its biggest cheerleaders? For example, take competition. It's one of capitalism's superpowers, right? Competition pushes companies to make their products as excellent as possible at the best possible price, to the benefit, above all, of the consumer. Interestingly, though, when business people talk amongst themselves about how to succeed, they don't always sing the praises of competition.
All right, good afternoon.
That's a young Sam Altman, who's now the CEO of OpenAI, the ChatGPT company, teaching a course at Stanford back in 2014 about how to do a startup. He's introducing a special guest speaker.
Today's speaker is Peter Thiel. Peter was the founder of PayPal and Palantir and Founders Fund and has invested in most of the tech companies in Silicon Valley.
Thiel steps in front of the class and comes right out with his central piece of advice. An idea he says he's completely obsessed with.
If you're starting a company, if you're the founder, entrepreneur starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly. And you want to always avoid competition. And so, hence, competition is for losers, something we'll be talking about today.
Thiel, who is known these days as a mentor and patron to J.D. Vance, went on to offer some familiar examples of companies that are nailing it, in his view.
If you look at sort of some of the big tech companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, They've just been building up cash for year after year, and you have these incredibly high profit margins. And I would say that one of the reasons the tech industry in the U.S. has been so successful financially is because it's prone to creating all these monopoly-like businesses, and it's reflected by the fact that these companies just accumulate so much cash they don't even know what to do with it beyond a certain point.
The leaders of those tech giants probably weren't thrilled by Thiel's comment, since they've all been sued for monopolistic practices by the U.S. and European governments, along with Facebook, which Thiel neglected to mention. Business people don't usually put it as bluntly as Thiel did, but it is standard practice in the business world, and completely rational, for someone looking to invest or start a company to choose an industry with few or no competitors. Adam Smith, back there in the 18th century, could not have imagined Google, Facebook, or Amazon. But he did know a monopoly when he saw one, and he raged against the rent-seeking, the price gouging, that the monopolists of his time engaged in. This was Smith's obsession. Markets, he said, should be managed intelligently to maximize competition in every way. Competition between companies to win customers, and as we heard back in episode 4, he wanted workers to have leverage too, so employers would have to compete for their labor, pushing up wages. In one more famous passage from The Wealth of Nations, Smith laments another way in which business people conspire to avoid competition, by colluding with one another.
People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices.
For people who believe in capitalism but want it to work better for more people, examples like these can lead to one kind of response: laws and regulations, thoughtfully designed to level the playing field so markets do in fact bring good things to lots of people. This could mean a return to what historian Brad DeLong called the arsenal of social democracy: empowered labor unions, stronger environmental protections with robust enforcement, higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy, both to raise revenue for public projects and to reduce the astronomical wealth gap between the richest people and the rest of us. Getting to a better capitalism could also mean reining in what many consider the excesses of financialization, those maneuvers by investors and corporations to make money, as Oren Cass puts it, by turning financial assets in circles.
Yeah, stock buybacks are a fascinating case study in all of this.
Cass, who we also heard from in episode 7, is founder of the conservative group American Compass. When corporations haul in profits they don't know what to do with, they increasingly just buy up more of their own stock, rather than raising their workers' pay or investing in a new factory or product. Buybacks tend to drive up the stock price for the company's shareholders. For Cass, buybacks are another way that companies turn themselves into financial playthings, instead of being a source of prosperity for their communities.
When you say, we're concerned about these stock buybacks, it seems to be companies disgorging massive amounts of capital instead of investing it. The response from what I would call the market fundamentalists, who believe markets can do no wrong, regardless of what rules there are, or especially if there are no rules, what they will say is, no, this is good. The company is returning the capital because they can't think of as good a use for it as someone else will. So now the people who receive the capital as investors will put it into other companies that will do more and better investment. And this is how we become more productive.
He says the trouble is there's no evidence that this is actually what happens.
When you think about the people who actually receive the proceeds of stock buybacks, they're not people out there looking for places to make real investments that deploy productive capital. They're people who are going to put it into their index funds, and off we go, spinning up more assets in circles. And so the net effect is actually to disgorge capital out of the productive economy, away from corporations that might actually deploy it, and back into the financial market where it may not do anything productive at all.
Stock buybacks became legal during the Reagan administration in 1982. The practice has grown more and more common, especially these days as corporate profits soar to record levels. In 2022, companies in the S&P 500 did more than $1 trillion in stock buybacks for the first time. The economist Jayati Ghosh of the University of Massachusetts says the practice should simply be outlawed.
The only thing it does is encourage the managers who are largely paid in these stock options to increase their own wealth. That's the only purpose it serves. So why on earth is it even allowed?
Another strategy that progressives, at least, would suggest for putting corporate profits to more productive use is to tax them more heavily. The 2017 tax cuts under Trump slashed the corporate rate from 35% to 21%. Trump has proposed cutting it further to 15%. Kamala Harris says she'll push Congress to raise the corporate rate to 28%. As dry as it can be to talk about, the investment of capital and the rules and guardrails around that activity have a powerful influence on what happens in the world. Remember John Fullerton in episode 1 talking about his epiphany a couple decades ago, that bankers like him were, in important ways, doing destructive work.
I then sort of looked in the mirror and realized it was young kids like me who think they're so smart who are actually driving, because finance really drives the economy. It's what the economy is in service to financial capital in more ways than we realize.
By this point in our season, it should be clear what John's talking about. The people who control those mountains of capital really are the deciders. Should I spend this capital to build affordable housing and address that critical shortage, or put it into a private equity firm that's buying up homes and flipping them for a quick profit? Should I invest my capital in any traditional sense, in the real economy, towards production of any actual product or service, which would almost certainly create jobs, or just put it into some esoteric financial instrument that'll kick out a few cents on the dollar? John Fullerton says he has lobbied U.S. government officials, unsuccessfully, to adopt a tax on financial transactions.
The idea behind that was to sort of discourage some of the worst short-term speculative activity, because if you tax transactions at the point of trade, just a tiny little fraction of a percent, it actually would make a lot of that trading activity uneconomic. It would add a cost to it that would make it uneconomic. And, so to make it simple, instead of investing, a wealthy family putting money in a high-frequency trading strategy that trades stocks in nanoseconds and scalps little pennies out and ends up with earning 8% return, that same wealthy family might invest in a solar company that's building solar farms. And so you'd shift the money from the speculative economy into the real economy and aligned with something that the real economy actually needs, which is to transition out of fossil fuels and into solar energy.
There are lots of people out there trying to change the behavior of investors. For example, the many organizations that promote impact investing, which means they steer investor dollars to companies and projects that try to do good in the world and not just to generate profit. But that's a hard sell to investors who are steeped in the expectation that they must always maximize the return on investment. In fact, people investing for institutions like mutual funds typically have a legal fiduciary duty to maximize return. It's really their only job. That might seem like an insurmountable challenge for someone trying to promote an investment in, say, a company committed to environmental sustainability. But here's someone who thinks he has a convincing response to those investors. So shall we just have at it here?
Let's dive in.
Let's do it. Rick Alexander is another guy, like John Fullerton, who once had a career at the center of the capitalist system and was nobody's activist.
So my first career couldn't be farther from the career that I'm currently in.
Alexander now lives in western Massachusetts, but he spent a lot of years doing corporate law in Wilmington, Delaware, where more than half of America's largest companies are incorporated. Eventually, Rick's work introduced him to the B Corp movement. B Lab wanted Delaware to create a new legal entity and corporate structure, the Benefit Corporation, so B Corps could operate in the state.
And at the time they came to Delaware, I was the chair of this committee of the bar that sort of every year would look at the statute and look at what was happening in the world and decide whether changes were needed. And to be like candid, we just kind of laughed and we said, well, that's cute. That's something like, Ben and Jerry's. They were one of the early B Corps. That's something like Ben and Jerry would like, but we're serious. Delaware, all the big multi-billion-dollar companies are incorporated here. We're not interested in that. But they were persistent.
Alexander started doing research into the B Corp idea and the wider network, though still pretty small and fringy, of business reformers.
There's this whole movement out there talking about stakeholder capitalism and conscious capitalism and all these different things out there. And I started looking at them. And the one thing, there was an academic, her name was Lynn Stout. She's passed away too early, but at the time she was a corporate law professor at Cornell. And one of the things she said was that, well, people also have interests, just like self-interest, just like corporations. But people don't walk around saying, I'm just always going to take as much as I can from every situation that I can and never think about anyone else's interests. And when you do meet people like that, you call them a sociopath. And then she went on to say, and corporations are the most powerful force in our society, arguably. Why do we want to program them to be sociopathic? And I was sort of convinced by that.
He was so convinced, Rick went to work for B Lab for years. Then he says he had another idea. A light bulb went on. And he started his own thing in 2020.
So currently, professionally, I am the CEO of the Shareholder Commons, and we're a small nonprofit that basically we work with investors, institutional investors, and we try to catalyze a sort of shareholder activism.
In pursuing that goal, Alexander and Shareholder Commons take a distinctive approach, one that doesn't rely on the altruism of investors. Now, stay with me here, folks. As I mentioned before, activists who try to persuade investors to prioritize the public good will often be thwarted by that fiduciary duty, the institutional investor's legal mandate to maximize the growth of their portfolios. But Rick Alexander points out that in today's world, where a typical pension or mutual fund is invested in hundreds of companies or more, those funds are really betting on the economy as a whole. The short-term performance of a single company in the portfolio is almost negligible.
And so the most important factor for a pension fund isn't whether company X, has a high margin and high sales. The most important factor for them is how the economy performs. 90% of their return is going to be dependent on how the market performs overall. And what that means is that it's a bad trade for them if a company in their portfolio increases its own profits and its own enterprise value in a way that threatens the systems that all the companies are relying on, like emitting a lot of greenhouse gas or creating a lot of inequality that leads to, threats to democracy.
For example, Alexander says, if Meta, the parent company of Facebook, engages in practices that attract lots of eyeballs to the site, but harm the mental health of young people, or spread misinformation that threatens democracy, that might be good for Mark Zuckerberg's bottom line, because he owns many billions of dollars in Meta stock. But it's a bad investment for your pension fund, which holds shares in a whole bunch of companies and just a sliver of Meta stock. Because the long-term strength of your portfolio depends on a healthy democracy and a society of mentally healthy people.
I often have this discussion with people, and then like sort of light bulb goes on, and they're like, yeah, of course, obviously. If I'm a shareholder and I own a company and I own 999 other companies, I don't want that one company to succeed if it's going to hurt the other 999 companies. That's obvious.
So Alexander has designed a strategy for approaching investors that's based on their self-interest and that of their clients. He's trying to persuade portfolio managers to make different choices based on a broader perspective, not just the immediate return on a single investment. But as our interview goes on, it's clear that Rick has other concerns about, for example, humanity crashing through planetary boundaries because of unrestrained economic growth.
It's not just the climate, it's nitrogen, it's deforestation, it's soil.
Finally, I press him about his own motivation. The health of investment funds or something else?
And so I don't know what my question is, but sort of which is it, or...
You caught me. My motivation for the work we do at the Shareholder Commons is not that I woke up one morning and was worried that pension funds would not be able to meet their liabilities. My motivation is that, there's too much carbon coming out from our economy, even in my lifetime. I mean, I can watch the news, but certainly for the next generation and the generation after. So that's my motivation. But I authentically believe.
He really does believe, he says, that his economic argument is a powerful one. That for the people managing large piles of financial assets, it's smart and financially responsible to invest in companies that support the health and well-being of people, the non-human natural world, and society. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Call me crazy, but if we have civilizational collapse in 30 years, our portfolios aren't going to be looking too good, are they?
Nope.
Interesting stuff, John. Rick Alexander's concept with his organization, Shareholder Commons, just seems kind of sensible, doesn't it? To get people to think more broadly about the impact of their investments?
Yes, and to see that their long-term self-interest is at stake. Rick Alexander mentioned this law professor, Lynn Stout, who passed away a few years ago, and her point about people who think only about their own self-interest being sociopaths, or actually psychopaths is the word she used. She also said this.
Most shareholders are what we call pro-social, meaning they understand and they are happy to be concerned about the interests of other people, the planet, and future generations.
I think that's a wonderful framing, John. We're so used to thinking of shareholders and stakeholders being in constant conflict, but this brings up the notion that buried in the shareholder perspective is a stakeholder view where what happens in the world really matters. And it reminds me of the indigenous American idea that the job is to make decisions based on the well-being of folks coming 7 generations in the future.
Yeah, in fact, I said that to Rick Alexander, and he agreed that it's a similar idea. It's the kind of thing that I think a lot of regular people see pretty clearly, and a lot of us scratch our heads, that the people running corporations and investment funds seem to operate with blinders on, just laser focused on their short-term bottom line.
Right. Don't the executives of fossil fuel companies think about their grandchildren?
Another example, I was reading recently about insurance companies. They're having to stop selling property insurance in whole parts of the world and the country because with so many natural disasters happening, thanks to climate change, their business is just becoming untenable in these places. They're having to pay more claims than they can handle. So some people have suggested that maybe insurance companies should reconsider granting insurance policies to fossil fuel companies and their drilling projects for the good of their own industry and its financial viability.
Oh, man, that's just some crazy talk, John. Do you mean to tell me that one thing is actually connected to another? But one problem I see with Rick Alexander's approach is that he's still appealing to the bottom line. And this is something I've found again and again with so many capitalist reform efforts. ESG, stakeholder capitalism, and so on. Folks are trying to get people to run their businesses differently. But they feel compelled to say, but your profits won't suffer.
Right. You can do more good, but don't worry, you'll still be doing just as well as you're doing now.
And I'm afraid that's just not going to get it done. If you're not breaking out of the core assumption that the number one task of business is to make a profit, and not just that, the largest possible profit, then it's hard to see real change coming. And sure enough, after years of this kind of talk and these earnest efforts, real change has not come. So I think what this episode shows is both the promise and the limitations of these voluntary efforts. Folks like B-Lab with the B Corp movement and benefit corporations and Rick Alexander with his drive to get investors to think and behave differently. These are attempts to shift the culture and the goals of business and finance.
And that's inspiring. But at this rate, that shift will take generations, and we don't have that kind of time. That Frederick Douglass quote comes to mind, doesn't it, Ellen? Power concedes nothing without a demand.
It never did, and it never will.
For those of us who live in democracies, or so we tell ourselves, is it outrageous to think we should just demand that our government codify how we want business to conduct itself? Make these practices that some businesses are doing voluntarily mandatory.
You're going all radical again, John. But seriously, this brings us back to what I think is a central theme in this whole series. What's an economy for? And who decides? Isn't it supposed to take care of us and serve us and the world?
Or are we supposed to sacrifice ourselves and our future and our only home in this universe to feed it?
There is indeed another big picture challenge to the long-term viability of capitalism, and that's the question of growth.
Right. The need for never-ending growth is pretty much baked into a capitalist economy, and for most for-profit businesses, even if they're not necessarily pursuing maximum profits. Many still feel they'd need to look endlessly for new markets, new customers, new sources of materials for their products. So if you think about episode 9 in this series on the book, The Limits to Growth,
the fact that we're blowing through planetary boundaries and we can't continue on this trajectory without causing our industrial civilization to collapse, possibly quite soon at this point, is there any way around that dilemma? More than a few experts, ecologists, and even economists now say the answer is no, that capitalism is inherently unsustainable.
And that we need to move toward a post-growth or even a degrowth economy. Not surprisingly, that is a hotly debated point.
But there's one other change, just as fundamental, I think, that's required to build an economy that's fair and just. And I'm talking about power.
Ellen, you've made this point when we've talked offline, and you've written about it. And think about the examples in this episode. These are stories about people with power in the capitalist system, right? The people who own capital and run corporations, making different, more thoughtful or ethical or generous choices.
And I know firsthand that there are lots of good and decent people in those positions who want to do the right things. But I just don't see how we'll address the severe failings of this economic system until we put a lot more power in the hands of the people and groups that for so long have been marginalized, who have been on the receiving end of capitalist exploitation.
Next time, in our concluding episode, I know we could go on, there is so much more that could be said, but we are going to wrap things up for now. So next time, beyond capitalism, some ideas for and some living, breathing examples of economic practices that reject the core assumptions and structures of capitalism. This episode was made by me with Ellen McGirt and our story editor, Loretta Williams. Music by Michelle Osis, Alex Simcox, Goodnight Lucas, Lily Hayden, and Chris Westlake. Music consulting by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. Adam Smith voiceover by Ewan Kerr. Recording help from Mike Toda and Ben James. You can find a transcript of this and every one of our episodes, and information about our team, at xenonradio.org. This season is produced in partnership with Imperative 21. The show is distributed by our friends at PRX. Xenon Radio comes to you from the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University.